La preuve que des fois, juste une présence peut mobiliser une salle. Alors, bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. Je m'appelle Sarah-Christine Jemson, je suis la directrice générale d'Action Canada. And along with being Action Canada's executive director, I am also a cyclist in Toronto all year long. And near where I live, there is an intersection. It is a residential street that intersects with a major artery, and there's a traffic light. And because it's a residential street, the traffic light is only triggered if something comes along to trigger it and turn it green. So if a car drives up, the motion sensor detects it, and the light turns green. If a pedestrian comes along, they can press a button, and the light will turn green. But cyclists aren't recognized in this system. So when I pull up, I have two choices. I can wait and wait and wait until a car or a pedestrian comes along, or I can kind of get half off my bike and shuffle along to the post that's several meters away and press the button to get a green light. And this drives me crazy. And it is only a very small example of a gap in our transportation system, and not a very important one, because most of the time I can enjoy my bike rides. But the fellows here, the Action Canada fellows, have looked at really important gaps in our transportation policy and infrastructure. Gaps that leave entire groups unsafe. Gaps where a process is missing a piece that undermines sustainability, or where certain modes of transportation are prioritized over the whole in a way that is also unsustainable. Mais ils n'ont pas juste trouvé des problèmes, ils ont trouvé des solutions, des recommandations en politique publique qui valent l'attention des décideurs en politique publique. And that's why we're here today, to hear from them. So before we go any further, I would like to invite Gabriel Jean-Simon, qui va venir nous faire une reconnaissance de territoire. Gabriel is a fellow, an alumni from the very first cohort, and also a Montrealer, and he will give us a land acknowledgement. Merci, Gabriel.
Merci. Bonjour à tous. Avec Action Canada, nous reconnaissons que cet événement se déroule sur des terres autochtones non cédées. Nous reconnaissons la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Tiohtià:ke, ou Montréal, est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour de nombreuses Premières Nations et aujourd'hui une population autochtone diversifiée ainsi que d'autres peuples y résident. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations continues entre les peuples autochtones et autres personnes de la communauté montréalaise. Nous espérons pouvoir apprendre des gardiens et gardiennes traditionnels de Tiohtià:ke, Montréal, et poursuivre notre croissance en tant que communauté en respectant la terre et en honorant les esprits qui nous unissent pour échanger et débattre de nos idées. With Action Canada, we acknowledge that this event is taking place on unceded Indigenous land. We recognize the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the traditional custodians of the land and waterways on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as the gathering place for many First Nations, and today is home to a diverse Indigenous population as well as other peoples. It is with respect for the connections to the past, present, and future that we acknowledge the ongoing relationships between Indigenous peoples and other members of the Montreal community. We hope to learn from the traditional custodians of Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and to continue to grow as a community, respecting the earth and honoring the spirits that bring us together to share and debate our ideas.
Merci, Gabriel. And so now, just a bit of an overview of our agenda, le temps qu'on va passer ensemble aujourd'hui. Alors, on va bientôt avoir un mot de notre partenaire principal pour cet événement, Via Rail. Ensuite, je vais vous donner une petite idée de qui est Action Canada, qui sont ces fellows et pourquoi est-ce qu'ils sont ici. So, who are these young people who have thought about transportation, sustainable transportation, and why are we here? And then, of course, the main reason why you're here, the presentations. So we'll have 3 10-minute presentations, and after that, we'll have the opportunity for a few clarifying questions, because after the presentations, you'll have the chance to engage in a dialogue. So we'll invite you, both virtually and in person, to join the group that compelled you the most or that raised the most questions for you, where you'll be able to further discuss with fellows their reports. Vous avez remarqué, je passe d'une langue à l'autre. This presentation will be in both official languages. Technology is magical now and has made great leaps and bounds. So if you're on Zoom and you don't understand both official languages, you can go in the bottom right corner and there is a simultaneous interpretation option that you can choose to add to your viewing experience. J'aimerais maintenant remercier nos partenaires sans qui on ne serait pas ici aujourd'hui. Alors, a big thank you to Inspire, merci à Power Corporation du Canada, le Secrétariat aux relations canadiennes et Via Rail. J'en profite aussi pour remercier la Maison du développement durable qui nous accueille ici aujourd'hui et leur partenaire principal Hydro-Québec et Desjardins, leur partenaire majeur. Et maintenant, I would like to introduce Vanessa Cherenfant, chef de la direction stratégie avec Via Rail, notre partenaire pour cet événement. Bonjour Vanessa.
Merci. Oui. Alors, bon après-midi. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Il me fait grand plaisir, en fait, d'être avec vous ce soir comme partenaire de l'événement. Via Rail, as you know, operates a national rail passenger service across Canada from coast to coast. And obviously, with the team around sustainable transport, we had to be involved in this event. And we were really happy to be able to offer actually the different tickets for you to go around the country and see for yourself what are the opportunities, what are the challenges around sustainable transport. De notre côté, bien sûr, avec toutes nos années à opérer un train à travers le Canada, nous avons, je veux dire, on a une place première de pouvoir aussi observer les besoins au niveau des différentes communautés que nous desservons et surtout au niveau des besoins de modernisation et d'évolution. La modernisation a d'ailleurs été une partie centrale en fait de notre évolution à Via Rail au cours des dernières années. So essentially, within the last years, we invested a lot around modernizing not only our equipment, but the way we operate as well. So some of you might have experienced the new trains that we launched last year, essentially in the corridor. We also launched a reservation system at the end of last year to be able to improve the customer experience that you all have, that we can offer to Canadians. You might have heard as well, with all the publicity that we had last week, the efforts that we're really putting into renewing the long-distance regional services, which is essentially a core part of what we deliver at Via Rail, parce qu'on parle en fait d'une route de plus de 10 000 km. On dessert plus de 250 communautés quand même à travers ces différentes routes. Donc c'est crucial pour nous d'avoir des solutions durables, mais aussi d'avoir accès à des leaders tels que vous qui peuvent réfléchir à l'avenir, qui peuvent amener en fait des politiques qui sont ambitieuses et qui pourront effectivement nous permettre d'avoir des solutions de transport que nous méritons. Je dis que nous méritons parce qu'on veut faire plus, il faut faire plus. Alors nous avons très hâte to listen to you, to see the ideas that you've come up with, to see the opportunities that maybe we can also implement. Alors je vous remercie de votre implication, merci aussi de l'opportunité de contribuer à ce programme et je vous souhaite bon succès dans vos présentations. Thank you.
Merci Valérie. Alors, c'est quoi Action Canada et pourquoi sommes-nous ici? So, Action Canada is a public policy leadership program that seeks to build leaders to serve this country. So, over a 10-month period, we bring together emerging leaders from all across the country, from all different backgrounds and from all different sectors, to develop their leadership skills, to learn about the country, and to learn how public policy works. Et en plus d'avoir la grande chance de voyager à différents coins du pays, cette année, ils sont allés à Halifax, Whitehorse, Windsor et maintenant ici à Montréal. They also look at a major policy challenge facing the country. And this year, the theme was sustainable transportation. And so each group, the fellows were broken up in 3 groups, and each group picked a sub-angle of this huge topic to do research, consultations with people across the country, to put together a portrait of what's going on in that space, but more importantly, to find solutions and recommendations that public policy leaders can take forward. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first group to come up on the stage for their presentation.
Penser différemment pour agir différemment. Trop longtemps, la durabilité a été synonyme d'éviter des dommages dans un système économique fondé sur la croissance. Aujourd'hui, on vous pose la question « Pourquoi ?» Une nouvelle définition est nécessaire. Une définition dans laquelle le transport durable peut activement faire le bien. Pour ce faire, on a besoin d'un changement de paradigme. On doit passer du profit à la raison d'être, de la linéarité à la circularité, de l'extraction à la régénération. 80% des Canadiens aujourd'hui habitent dans des centres urbains. Les transporter de manière durable pourrait avoir un effet bénéfique sur l'économie canadienne, sur sa compétitivité, sa capacité d'innovation et sur la qualité de vie de nos concitoyens. Ce changement commence par la manière dont les décisions sont prises. Une meilleure gouvernance aurait un impact transformateur sur les collectivités en permettant des solutions innovantes en matière d'urbanisme. À son tour, un aménagement du territoire repensé permettrait aux gens de plus facilement faire des choix de mobilité durable. Aujourd'hui, on vous invite à ouvrir vos esprits, à ouvrir vos cœurs et à réimaginer ce que la durabilité pourrait être et devrait être pour le transport au Canada. Bienvenue dans un avenir régénératif.
Thanks, Daria. Folks, you could buy the most beautiful, fanciest, cushiest, comfiest, coziest couch. But if your house is already tilting sideways and your foundation is all out of whack, you, your couch, and your house are going to have a bad time in the future. Such is the state of sustainable transportation development across urban centers in this country. Governance and decision-making structures are the vital foundation that underpin sustainable transportation development in this country, and I'm here to talk to you about a few of those conversation points. Alors, la façon dont nous prenons les décisions sont pas modernes et ils prioritisent l'économie, et pas assez de priorité sur l'environnement ni la société. When we think about representative decision-making, we actually know that these enhance social cohesion and environmental protections and actually have the opportunity and the potential to unleash great economic potential through investment and attraction. Alors, il y a des meilleures façons. Currently, the way that we represent public interest in decision-making leaves a little bit to be desired. N'a-t-il pas l'impression que les décisions ont été déjà faites, que l'environnement, ça vient à la fin, que la société est souvent, elle est simply an afterthought? Doesn't it sometimes feel like that our leaders, they make these decisions and then, after the fact, they justify those decisions by adding a harm reduction strategy at the end? What if we could, and I know this sounds crazy, but what if we could just not inflict harm in the first place? The current governance machine is not regenerative. It is unimaginative. So I invite you to imagine with me. Imagine a future that perhaps is not car-centric, is people-centric, is community-centric. Imagine if we could remember and recognize that the economy is not here to serve, if we could remember and recognize that the economy is here to serve society, not the other way around. Il y a une meilleure façon. There is a better way. And so we recommend the establishment of sustainable transportation development committees in every major city across the country. These committees are born from innovative and modern governance solutions that we have seen across the world and applied to a Canadian transportation lens. These committees would give a voice to the voiceless, underrepresented groups, but also natural resources. Imagine that. Imagine that clean air could have an equal voice at the table, a vote as to whether or not a new bridge is developed, and that fish could have a voice as to whether or not a new bridge over troubled waters is developed. This is the future that we can have, and we've seen this model employed, and as we've learned from our great friends at Vélo Québec here in Quebec, good policy isn't enough. We need governance, we need strategic and strong decision-making paradigms and frameworks that make sure that we get better infrastructure, but also healthier societies and thriving economies. If we get this governance piece right, this foundational piece, we can unleash outcomes across this country and cities across our great nation. And my colleagues, Madison and Tessica, will take you down that story next.
Merci, Jotman. Now we will focus on the opportunity of land reform to assure that, first and foremost, the cities are built for the people who live in them. Nous devons agir avec urgence parce que nous allons à vitesse grand V dans la mauvaise direction. Au courant des 2 dernières décennies, l'étalement urbain a significativement augmenté dans les 9 plus grands centres urbains au Canada. D'un océan à l'autre, nous occupons, chacune et chacun, plus d'espace en moyenne, et ce, en habitant de plus en plus loin du centre de la ville. But how cities are built is inextricably linked to how people move around. City development is a public policy issue. It's determined by zoning and land use policies, which in turn determine how the population is distributed. So urban sprawl has led to an increased dependency on cars. It's led to less efficient public transit systems and a reduced use of active transportation methods. And Professor Catherine Morancy summed it up perfectly by stating that bad urban planning decisions are responsible for exactly this. The video. Okay, sir, it's okay. So for exactly what you see behind me right now, and this is our transportation problems. So moving forward, how do we go from bad urban planning to good urban planning? Or should I say, how do we go towards truly sustainable urban planning? So at the core of the solution is transit-oriented development to create livable and thriving communities. And transit-oriented development creates compact, pedestrian-oriented, mixed-use communities that is, at its core, focused around high-quality transit systems. So now, let's dive into exactly how we can get there.
Thanks, Madison. So our second recommendation is to reform land use and zoning practices to enable and promote urban infill and mixed-use zoning. So let's define those two things. Urban infill is the process of developing vacant or underutilized parcels within existing developments. It's important because this increased density allows for people to live close to where they work, live, and play, thus decreasing the need for travel in the first place. Mixed-use zoning is the integration of residential, commercial, cultural, and transportation functions within a single structure or a single neighborhood. And by contrast, single-use zoning separates these different functions, forcing people to travel long distances to work from home and to dropping off their kids. So together, urban infill and mixed-use zoning creates the density and the ridership required to build efficient public transit. La prochaine recommandation, c'est d'exiger que tous les projets de développement urbain sur les terrains publics donnent la priorité au développement du transport en commun et des transports actifs. Cela signifie remplacer les villes pour que les gens puissent marcher, rouler ou prendre du transport en commun pour presque tous leurs besoins quotidiens. Cette politique exige aussi que les urbanistes coordonnent avec les planificateurs de transport dès le début de leur projet en développement. Alors, avec plus d'options de transport en commun et actifs, on veut aussi plus d'options pour les individus.
Merci, Tessica. Donc, après une gouvernance plus représentative et des villes mieux pensées, qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait faire au niveau individuel pour encourager un transport qui est plus durable? On ne se le cachera pas, l'auto, c'est pratique. Puis, avec le temps, on ne s'attend pas à ce que l'auto soit complètement éliminée de nos transports. Par contre, est-ce qu'on ne manque pas une occasion de limiter le nombre de voitures en circulation et d'encourager d'autres méthodes qui sont plus actives ou du transport collectif? L'idée, ce n'est pas de transiter de la voiture à essence à la voiture électrique. parce que les villes qui sont centrées sur l'automobile engendrent leur lot de problèmes sociaux, environnementaux et économiques. Mais il ne faut pas se leurrer aussi, les transitions vers des villes qui ne sont pas centrées sur l'automobile, ça prend du temps. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire à court terme pour encourager les Canadiens et les Canadiennes à ne plus se fier sur leur voiture? On a une opportunité de créer des politiques qui incitent le transport collectif et le transport actif et d'offrir du soutien financier pour permettre aux Canadiens et aux Canadiennes de diversifier leurs options.
Et donc, notre 4e recommandation est d'introduire un programme de remise pour les conducteurs titulaires d'un permis de conduire qui n'ont pas de voiture immatriculée dans leur ménage pour qu'ils investissent dans des options de mobilité durable, comme l'achat d'un vélo, l'achat de passes mensuelles pour le transport en commun ou encore pour des options d'autopartage. Notre recommandation va donc au-delà de la simple incitation à se débarrasser de son véhicule. On veut promouvoir un mode de vie qui est sans voiture solo, parce que oui, c'est possible de partager une voiture. L'autopartage existe déjà dans plusieurs grandes villes au Canada, mais de manière bien inégale. Si vous êtes à Montréal, vous essayez de louer une communauté la fin de semaine, à 5 heures le soir ou encore durant la semaine de relâche comme en ce moment, vous le savez que c'est probablement bien difficile. La raison, c'est qu'il manque de voitures. Dans d'autres villes, c'est complètement le contraire. Il y a un bassin d'utilisateurs qui est tellement petit, ce qui rend le service inefficace. Les politiques publiques ont un rôle à jouer dans cette situation. Comment? Avec un environnement réglementaire qui est flexible, qui est favorable, en ce qui concerne notamment la priorité pour l'achat de voitures aux compagnies d'autopartage, en octroyant des permis, des places de stationnement ou simplement en encourageant la collaboration avec les compagnies d'assurance. Et donc, notre 5e recommandation est de renforcer la coordination des politiques et des programmes pour favoriser le développement et la croissance des options d'autopartage. Parce que ça ne se fera pas du jour au lendemain, l'abandon de la voiture est un processus qui sera progressif et notre recommandation vise à améliorer et accélérer ce processus.
In conclusion, there is a need for transformative action in Canadian urban transportation policy. Policymakers can reimagine transportation as a force for good, capable of enhancing the environment, enhancing the economy, and enhancing the quality of life of all Canadians. Prioritizing nature, community, sustainability can create a brighter future. The vitality and resilience of our communities depends on this. This is urgent, and the need for a regenerative policy in Canadian urban transportation is now. Thank you for your time.
Okay, so I now turn to you, audience, to see if you have any clarifying questions. Annie, on va t'amener un micro.
Merci Sarah-Christine. Bonjour, mon nom est Annie Sabourin, je suis une ancienne d'Action Canada en 2012. Je vous félicite pour votre présentation bilingue. C'était très apprécié. J'ai une question très pratique. Pour que vos recommandations puissent aller le plus loin possible. À quel palier de gouvernement vous pensez quand vous faites ces recommandations-là? Quel palier en priorité? Puis qu'est-ce que ça prendrait pour que les gouvernements puissent les mettre en œuvre? Merci.
Je peux répondre peut-être au moins à la première partie de la question. Donc, puisqu'il est question beaucoup dans notre papier de gouvernance, mais aussi de gouvernance qui amènerait le changement dans l'urbanisme. Donc, on pense beaucoup aux villes parce que dans le système actuel, évidemment, c'est les villes qui sont responsables ou qui ont cette compétence-là et c'est elles aussi qui organisent le territoire de façon à ce que le transport peut se faire réellement par les citoyens. Donc, notre logique actuellement, elle tourne beaucoup autour du palier, j'aime pas beaucoup le mot palier, mais du niveau municipal là, ou des ordres de gouvernement municipaux. Ouais.
Oui.
My name is Amrit Grewal. I work for the Canada Federal Government at Canada Economic Development. I've also worked at Transport Canada. Thank you for the presentation. It's not a question, it's more of a comment that one size does not fit all. For your example for the communauté, in Montreal we have a pretty good public transport system. So not a lot of people have cars, and come semaine de relâche, everybody needs a car. So, and whereas in other countries like, let's say, Brampton or Toronto, everybody has a car, so they don't need that. So I just wanted to point that out. And also, you're right, it has to be at the municipal level. Anybody who knows the Mayor of Montreal knows how fanatic she is about this issue. We have bike paths everywhere, we have priority for pedestrians everywhere, and it's really the motorists who are pulling their hair at times. And you may have noticed that St. Catherine is partially closed. It's pedestrian only, so yeah, we're working towards that. I think at some point there's also talks of no cars in downtown, but doesn't that wreak havoc on the economy of downtown? Thank you.
Thank you, Amrit.
Can we still react?
Yeah, would you like to react?
Thank you so much for the comment and for sharing. I think one thing I would just want to maybe add to that is saying that we know that one size does not fit all, and I think that's really what we were trying to bring in our paper and what we bring in the report, so definitely dive into that, is that it's a holistic problem, and there's not looking at just one dimension or one intervention is clearly not enough, because we are not going in the right direction at the moment. So the question is, how can we work on it from multiple fronts, one being maybe on the more individual and really enabling safer infrastructure, more possibilities, more making transit systems more accessible, for example, or active transportation more accessible. But it's really working on multiple fronts and making those different realities or stakeholders work together in a more constructive way. Because just looking at it in one way that is uniform is really not enough. Yeah. So thank you so much for that.
It sounds like the beginning of a great conversation. So I will invite those of you who were intrigued to keep your thoughts and questions for the dialogue that we're going to have at the next presentation. So thank you to this group. And I will invite the next group to come up on stage. So the green group, if you'd like to join us on stage.
On August 17th, 2010, Amber Tuckerow, a 20-year-old First Nations woman from Mikisew Cree First Nation in northern Alberta, flew into Edmonton with her 15-month-old son and her friend. They were staying at a motel just a few kilometers east of the airport. The next day, Amber decided to head into Edmonton, but due to a lack of safe and affordable intercommunity mobility options, Amber had little choice but to hitchhike. Amber was never seen again. Tragically, her remains were found 2 years later in a farmer's field southeast of Nisku, not far from her motel. Amber's murder remains unsolved. Amber's life mattered. Her son lost his mother. Her mother lost her daughter. And her family and her friends miss her dearly and desperately need closure. When I first heard Amber's story, I was traumatized. It changed the way I mothered my children out of fear for their safety. According to the Native Women's Association of Canada, Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely than any other woman in Canada to go missing or to be murdered. And 73% of gender diverse and Two-Spirit plus Indigenous peoples have experienced violence in their lifetime. Policy changes are needed to protect Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit plus peoples. Our lives literally depend on it. Tansei. My name is Dale Arcan Morin, and I'm a Nehiao Esqueo, a Cree woman from Kaputagao in Treaty 6 territory. And nous sommes l'équipe verte. We are Team Green, Action Canada's inaugural all-Indigenous task force. Our policy paper is entitled Improving the Intercommunity Mobility of First Nations People in Canada, a response to Call for Justice 4.8.
My name is Deanna Starr, and I'm a citizen of Little Pine First Nation. Many have called for governmental action regarding the ongoing violence being perpetuated against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ people in Canada. Prior to December 2015, these calls were largely ignored by the federal government. It is because of the advocacy work of family members and grassroots Indigenous organizations that we are here speaking today. In 2014, Amnesty International presented a report urging the federal government of Canada to take immediate action through a comprehensive approach to addressing violence to Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people. The Government of Canada launched a national public inquiry in 2015. Families, including Amber Tuckerows, gathered across Canada to provide testimonies of their missing and murdered loved ones. These testimonies emphasize the impacts that the violence on Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people have on entire communities. This has led to the 2019 final report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people titled Reclaiming Power in Place, that reveals that human and Indigenous rights are the root causes behind human rights violations are the root causes behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people. The 231 recommendations that came out of the report are described as legal imperatives pertaining to culture, health, security, and justice. Call to Justice 4.8 recommends the need for safe and affordable transportation services and infrastructure for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people. Since the release of the report, only 2 out of the 231 calls for justice have been completed. Call for Justice 4.8 has not yet been started.
My name is Apoyaki. I'm a member of Ghana, and today I'm going to talk to you about the significance of our report. In our research, it was important to us to reach out to those who have firsthand experience with MMIWG2S+. We spoke to family members who've lost loved ones, to grassroots organizations, and to Indigenous community members, leaders, politicians, and organizations and programs who are partnering with Indigenous peoples to create safer modes of intercommunity mobility for MMIWG2S+. Our study moves the field forward in 3 ways. First is mobility justice, where First Nations can practice their agency and sovereignty to counter paternalistic government approaches that historically have dictated to First Nations. In this manner, mobility justice allows First Nations to act in accordance to principles of self-determination and community-led solutions. Second, we approach this work from a social sustainability perspective that is grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. This comes from a relational understanding that humans are not superior to animals, flora, fauna, water, and land, but rather we are in relation to them, which includes the sacred role of women in sustainability. Last is social justice. We use Greyhound Canada as our primary case study to explore the intricacies between the termination of Greyhound and the increase in MMIWG2S+ as a social justice issue. as many individuals now face the inability to escape dangerous situations, access to essential services, and educational and job opportunities, making them susceptible to exploitation and violence. Our recommendations call upon policymakers and advocates and communities to work collaboratively to find sustainable and equitable solutions that address transportation needs, which potentially can benefit all Canadians, regardless of their geographic location, socioeconomic status, race, or ethnicity.
Tanshe Kioao. My name is Alexandra Nychuk. I'm a CHIF and a citizen of the Manitoba Métis Federation. My colleague Andrea and I are going to walk you through our policy recommendations. As we go through them, I encourage you to follow along in your pamphlet on your one-pager, and also on page 7 of our report. In our slides, you will also see, right here behind me, a list of governmental bodies, in addition to entities that we are calling on for each particular report we are speaking to. Recommendation, pardon me. The first one speaks to systemic issues and the need for recognition as mobility as a social determinant of health. There's also a need to increase investment in safe, affordable, inter-community mobility for First Nations, which includes measurable outcomes. And thirdly, we call for First Nations government to be able to co-create safe transportation for their citizens and members.
Bonjour, bon après-midi, je m'appelle André, je suis originaire de Penetanguishene en Ontario. Notre deuxième recommandation vise sur certains enjeux de mobilité ainsi que le manque d'argent chronique dans les communautés des Premières Nations. Nous suggérons des idées simples et réalisables pour améliorer le transport public intercommunautaire pour les municipalités puissent bien servir les communautés des Premières Nations. Nous recommandons que le gouvernement du Canada établisse un appel de financement sous forme de subvention aux communautés des Premières Nations pour le transport commun, spécifiquement pour le transport commun. Cela aidera à avoir des transports publics sûrs, abordables et qui favorisent la durabilité. L'argent aidera à créer, maintenir et surveiller les transports publics et à soutenir l'extension des systèmes de transport publics municipaux aux réserves. Notre troisième recommandation concerne l'amélioration des données sur le transport commun dans les communautés des Premières Nations grâce à une approche axée sur l'analyse comparative entre les sexes plus. Cette approche permettra aux communautés des Premières Nations d'être des leaders dans la recherche sur les besoins de transport public. De plus, il est important que les communautés des Premières Nations soient formées pour qu'elles puissent gérer leurs propres données sur le transport et de développer leurs propres solutions grâce à ces données. Il faut aussi comprendre comment les nouveaux projets de transport affectent l'économie à long terme.
Our fourth recommendation asks to create a public awareness campaign that will be found outside public hubs of transportation, that will be found across the nation, to understand the root causes of violence, such as the intergenerational effects of colonization that affect Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit plus individuals. Our final recommendation speaks to the creation of an annual symposium where there will be a sharing of First Nations insights on sustainable transportation, and the aims will be to establish best practices in transportation policy for First Nations. What happened to Amber Tuckero is not an isolated incident. Implementing our group's recommendations ensures the safety of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit plus individuals. Individuals like Tiffany, Deanna, Dale, and myself. So we don't have to wonder if we're next. Kichi Marci.
Merci.
Nitsa Nitaki.
Nanaskaman.
Thank you. Hi.
Okay, so I open it up to the audience for questions. Et n'hésitez pas, pour ceux en ligne, d'écrire vos questions dans le chat et on viendra vers vous si vous en avez. So don't hesitate to add a question in the chat for those of you online. Ian.
Merci beaucoup. My name is Ian Van Haren. I was a fellow last year, originally from Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, and now live in Montreal. I'm wondering about, in a post-Greyhound era, it sounds like you looked a lot at Greyhound. I know in Alberta, for example, there's some small local providers that look at regional transport options, whereas Greyhound was a national company. If you think of Saskatchewan, there was the STC. What type of solutions or possibilities should these different levels of government be looking at for transport solutions?
I think the primary thing, thank you for your question, but I think the primary thing when we're considering solutions is ensuring that we are prioritizing self-determination in those solutions. So while there might be collaborations between provincial and federal governments and municipal governments, we also need to make sure when we're making those decisions, we're also including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis voices. I know our report focused on First Nations specifically, but also ensuring other Indigenous groups are also included in those considerations.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add, in the report, we do have some case studies where we do give examples like that, so that might be something you might be interested in taking a look at. Thanks.
Yes.
I don't know about other cities. My name is RP. I'm from Montreal. But in Montreal, we have kind of conglomerations almost of First Nations people who come and to the city. They don't have anywhere to go, and then they go to certain places. But then from those places, for them to go even to social services, etc., there is no transportation. Even within the city, it is a major issue, I think, for Montreal. I have tried to talk about it to the city of Montreal people, but I was wondering, you know, what we can do in those situations where we know where the people are and we know where they want to go from where they are.
Thank you, RP.
Okay, so thank you for your question. In terms of we didn't really look specifically at urban situations. We're more interested in moving between communities because although there are significant barriers for Indigenous people accessing transportation in urban areas, one of the greatest gaps kind of in our research that we found was more so moving between communities. And often, though there are services in urban settings, there's reasons they need to go back home to reserves, so First Nation reserves. And so there's a need for that specific kind of transportation.
Thank you so much, Green Group. Another round of applause. And I will invite up the next group. Prochain groupe, s'il vous plaît.
Try that again with the mic on. If you walk into a car dealership tomorrow, one of the first questions you're likely going to be asked is whether you're looking to purchase a gas or electric vehicle. We know that more and more Canadians are choosing to go electric. En fait, parmi les nouveaux véhicules, 1 sur 10 est maintenant électrique. Mais ce chiffre doit augmenter plus rapidement, car le gouvernement a décidé que d'ici 2035, tous les nouveaux véhicules devront être électriques. Pour faciliter la transition vers les VE, des investissements importants ont été réalisés, notamment des milliards de dollars dans la capacité nationale de fabrication de batteries. The EV transition holds huge potential, and it's one of the fundamental elements of the government strategy to decarbonize the transportation sector. But there's one key question that very few people are talking about. What happens to the batteries in EVs once they're no longer suitable to be used in a vehicle? Our report, which we're excited to present to you today, explores maximizing Canada's EV battery repurposing and recycling ecosystem.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, bonjour. Discussions on the transition to EVs have largely been focused on how green EVs really are. We hear a lot about how the cars and the batteries are made, and a little bit about how the electricity grid that will be powering it will, whether or not that's green. While those things are important, there hasn't been enough attention focused on what happens to EV batteries at the end of their life. We know that the potential negative environmental impacts and economic opportunity, positive economic opportunity that batteries and critical minerals can unleash is huge. However, in Canada, there is no comprehensive national policy regime that fully considers the economic, the regulatory, the environmental, and technical requirements that we need to effectively manage EV battery waste. So, our group believes that if we fail to plan, we plan to fail. I thought you guys would fill in that there for me. And so that it's critical that we prepare now to ensure that batteries will be safely and sustainably managed at the end of their vehicle lives.
In our report, we have identified 3 key challenges and offered solutions to them. Economic challenges. Our companies, both long-standing and startups, are competing internationally and are amongst the best, and they will benefit from a clearer regulatory environment in Canada with more targeted and more effective incentives to ensure their growth both for Canada and for them to compete internationally. They face regulatory challenges. There are conflicting and competing regulations between our provinces. That's in the provinces with regulations. Many have not yet set regulations. Regulatory clarity in rules, regulations, and guidelines will enable our companies to be more efficient, more innovative, and we must consider what's happening in the international landscape to ensure our companies can meet Canadian regulations and successfully export our innovations. Technical challenges are many. One of the key right now facing the companies is there are no guidelines, there are no standards. So we have companies out there creating their own proprietary systems because they must create their own proprietary systems and proprietary designs. This creates problems in repairing the batteries, so keeping them operational, repurposing the batteries, and eventually when we recycle them. When we address these challenges, we will extend the useful life of EV batteries. Mineral extraction and EV battery manufacturing has a notable carbon impact. Effective repurposing and recycling will spread this carbon impact across a longer time span, making it less intensive. We also will prevent the harm of these minerals, many of which are hazardous, ending up in our landfills. We will grow Canada's green economy already before we put in solutions to make our companies even more competitive. We are looking at 3,200 new jobs by 2030, a $281 million growth in our GDP. Again, that's just the baseline. We can go much further. and that does not account for the economic efficiencies and benefits that will result from repurposed batteries being used for things such as energy storage. We will secure our domestic supply chain. Urban mining, that is, mining the batteries we already have, getting those minerals out of them, and recycling them will decrease the demand for new minerals. That's good domestically because we do know that mining is challenging and has environmental impacts. But also, we are looking at the foreign side of this, which is we still have to import many of these key minerals, which exposes us to foreign uncertainty and political uncertainty. Urban mining, using those limited resources we have domestically, will help us succeed.
The good news is that these benefits are 100% within our reach. Our report puts forward 9 recommendations that provides us a clear roadmap of how we might get there, and we've grouped them under 3 broad themes. Our first theme is all about establishing a homegrown repurposing and recycling sector. There is no reason why Canadian workers and companies can't add value to the EV battery supply chain from beginning to end. And if we are serious about maximizing the environmental and economic return on investment of this entire EV transition, we can't just focus all of our energy on manufacturing the batteries and then stopping there. Repurposing and recycling is right now the missing link that can turn our supply chain from a linear one to a circular one. But as Joey said a minute ago, to be competitive on the global stage, we need the right mix of industry investments and market incentives. Right now, for example, the federal government, along with a handful of provinces, including Quebec, subsidizes the purchase of an EV. But as adoption rates of EVs go up, the value and the efficiency of those subsidies are going to go down. And so we believe that those blanket subsidies should be phased out over time in favor of more targeted rebates, which will essentially incentivize market or consumer demand for batteries that are repurposed and recycled right here at home by Canadian workers and Canadian technology.
The next set of recommendations has to do with favoriser le meilleur chemin pour les batteries en la fin de vie dans les véhicules. Essentially, what we want to figure out is how do we put a battery on the right pathway? How do we make sure that the right pathway gets to the right place at the right time? And our recommendations in this section really speak to achieving that. The first one that I'll speak about today is the state of health assessment. When you go out and you buy a new EV, the second you drive it off the lot, that battery is at 100%. But as you continue to drive it over time, it's just not going to work as well. You drive it for 100,000 kilometers, and maybe that battery is only ever going to charge to 90%, 85%, 80%. Interestingly enough, 80% is actually when it's considered to be end of life in a vehicle. What happens then? What are you going to do? How do you even know that your battery is reducing? Right now, that information is actually not available to you as the consumer, even though in your vehicle, if you're driving a new one off the lot today, a lot of the battery management systems are actually able to extract that data, and they should be able to give it to you. We believe that information should be easily accessible to you. Building upon that a little bit further, we're actually interested in a battery passport system. This is something that's being introduced in the European Union at the moment. It's something that's been developed by the Global Battery Alliance. And fundamentally what it is it's taking a state of health assessment a step further. It's making sure that if you are someone who is, a business working in recycling or repurposing, you want to understand, will this battery work for me to repurpose it in an energy storage system? Can I use this in a community microgrid? You need information on what is actually in that battery. You need information on the operational history, the chemistry. That information is not readily available. And so what a battery passport system is essentially when the battery is removed from the vehicle, there's a QR code that gives you that information. And that's the sort of information that you need to be able to make the right choices about, do we repurpose it? Do we recycle it? Where does it go from here so that we can make sure that we're maximizing the value of that battery?
Notre troisième et dernier thème est d'assurer le démantèlement, l'entreposage et le transport de manière sécuritaire et économique. As one example, because batteries often have to travel long distances across the country to reach repurposing and recycling facilities, and that current transport regulations often pose various challenges and inefficiencies related to batteries when they're designated as dangerous goods, we recommend that specific transport guidelines be developed for EV batteries. We think these should distinguish between intact and damaged batteries, and that they should align with US regulations. Enfin, nous pensons que le moment est venu, qu'il est temps de mettre en place les bonnes politiques pour garantir une gestion sûre et durable des batteries de VE en fin de vie. The wheels of Canada's EV transition are in motion. And when you take a new EV off the lot of a dealership, you want to feel confident that you've made a sustainable choice from start to finish. Repurposing and recycling EV batteries is not only environmentally sound, but is commercially viable if economic, regulatory, and technical challenges are addressed through proactive policy planning. Implementing our recommendations will create a coordinated approach that secures domestic and circular supply chains of critical minerals and allows Canada to maximize on its investment in the EV transition. Merci.
Okay, are there any questions for Team e-vehicle batteries? Des questions aussi pour ceux qui sont en ligne, n'hésitez pas à les mettre dans le chat. If you're online, don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat.
Hello, merci beaucoup. C'est quel pourcentage des véhicules sont électriques maintenant qui sont vendus au pays?
So what percentage of e-vehicle batteries, e-vehicles are sold in the country currently?
C'est 1 sur 10 maintenant, des nouveaux véhicules.
1 out of 10. 10%.
Your recommendations are very good because, you know, it's just at the beginning. And then, you know, I can imagine when everybody starts having EV vehicles, but I don't think it will happen. Partly it's an economic issue. So I think you should look into that also a little bit, how we can make the EV vehicles more affordable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to respond to that, thank you for the question. I think the government's absolutely looking at that and putting together many incentives to try to make them more affordable, and has also set very aggressive sales targets to come out over the next decades to move us towards the transition. But something to look at. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Andre Morrow. I'm an Action Canada Fellow, and I have a question for you. I saw that you mentioned that there's some conflicting regulations between provincial jurisdictions or even provincial federal. Could you kind of elucidate on what some of those conflicting regulations might be?
I can speak to one example, which is related to one of the recommendations we didn't quite get into, but it's about whether or not we need to regulate what happens to a battery at end of life. And so what we see so far in Canada is two different approaches that are emerging. Extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is a regime that's used in many different areas of society for managing waste. And we've seen in BC that they're using an EPR approach. They're exploring an EPR approach for EV batteries. So they would regulate producers, that they would have responsibility to manage the battery once it reaches end of life. But here in Quebec, they looked at that option and they decided that that wasn't the option they wanted to go with. So instead they're going with a voluntary regime, which allows for the OEMs, so the manufacturers, the vehicle manufacturers, to kind of sign up to be part of this program on a voluntary basis, and they would then take care of those batteries at the end of life. So we're seeing kind of a more kind of regulated approach versus a more voluntary approach. So we just want to make sure that there's more consistency in the approach overall, and that's something we explore further in our report.
There is a question in the chat, so I'm going to go over to Anne to
Yes,
share
we
the
have
question.
a question. Do you have any idea about how to engage all those in the supply chain?
How to engage who?
How to engage about how all those, yes, all the stakeholders. Yeah.
What would you like me to say, guys?
I can take a stab. I'm not sure which stakeholders, but a lot of our recommendations recognize, as Michelle's example just gave, there really are a lot of stakeholders, right? So even if you just look at governments, you've got all three levels. If you look at the industry, you have different tiers, right? So you have the OEMs, the companies that actually produce the vehicles, but the supply chain is made up of dozens or hundreds of smaller companies that feed into that supply chain. You've got environmental groups, you've got consumer rights groups, you've got technology groups, right? So everybody has an interest. And I think what we're saying and what we're seeing, what we've heard from our interviews, right now it's such a fast-moving kind of space, right? The technology is moving fast, the pace of innovation is moving fast, and we've heard this more than a couple times. It's kind of a wild west out there, right? So everybody's off doing their own thing to serve their own interests, and that's great, right? Innovation, that's kind of how it happens, but at a certain point, and we think that point's going to come up pretty fast, we do need to kind of slow down almost a little bit to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction and moving in the same way. And the whole reason for that is the whole point of this EV transition, again, presumably, is to fight climate change, right? And to create good jobs out of it, to improve our economies, to grow our economy. So if those are the two major goals, we can't have every single stakeholder, every single level of government, every company, every startup doing the best thing for themselves. We need to make sure we're doing the best thing for Canada, for our economy, and for our environment.
Thank you, James.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. Another round of applause for our Team Blue. And now we get to dialogue. So I'm going to invite all of you, people online and people in the room, to identify the group that compelled you the most and join them in a conversation. So pour ceux qui sont en ligne, vous allez avoir l'option de choisir une salle. Those of you online will have the option of which breakout room you want to join, identified by theme. And similarly, for those of us here, I invite the teams to get up and to move towards the door. And please follow the group of your choice to have a conversation. We'll be in 3 different rooms that are just around the corner over here. So you have about 20 minutes for the discussion. I'll come and get you. Alors, bienvenue de retour. J'invite les fellows qui vont faire le shareback à venir sur la scène. So if I can invite the two fellows who will be doing the shareback to come up on the stage. And welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to those of you online also. Sorry for, the delay, but it takes longer to go from a physical room to a physical room than it takes to be yanked out of your virtual room and brought back into the plenary virtual room. So I'm missing three fellows up here on the stage. If I can get the two people from each group who are going to be doing the shareback. So we're just going to very briefly hear from one person from each, two people from each group, one person from each subgroup. So they're just very briefly going to summarize a big takeaway or a big thought from their discussion that they had. And after, you're all very welcome to join us for a cocktail, mocktail, and some bitings and further discussion with the group. Alors, je passe le micro à Japman Bajaj, qui va nous donner un très court résumé de sa discussion.
She had to say très court because I have a really bad habit of holding the microphone for a very, 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 very long time. Okay. We had a beautiful discussion very quickly. We had a great discussion around the governance dialogue and the appropriate layer of government for which it should be pointed at, and to understand better whether or not it could be legislated at from different layers of government down towards cities. And had a vibrant dialogue with some of the folks in the room who have personal first-hand experience dealing with municipal governments on implementing good policy into good decision making. So it was a good room to have people who have dealt with it firsthand every single day to also respond to folks who are studying it intimately in their careers. So it was a good mix of people.
Thanks, Chapman. In the same group, we also had a discussion about balancing the needs of urban infill with also the pressure that it places on cultural communities, and in particular, the example of Chinatown was raised, where there's encroachment or the threat of densification, but also gentrification as a result of that. And so we kind of talked about what are the ways that we can densify, but also in a way that preserves affordability and the vitality and the cultural heritage that's there in the city. And so we talked a little about community land trusts, but there are many other models and solutions out there.
In our group, we talked a little bit about the need for collaboration between the various levels of government, federal, provincial, First Nations, and municipal. And that could be that might be pretty difficult, especially with First Nations often not having the ability to contribute financially to something like that. And then we also talked about the importance of keeping proper data so that we can exemplify the need for these transportation solutions.
Puis OK, ouais. Donc, alors, on a aussi parlé des enjeux en termes de durabilité de financement, la profitabilité, ainsi que assurer qu'on a un mode de transport qui assure la sécurité, le bien-être, mais aussi on peut fier là-dessus. Puis pour nous, on a regardé la durabilité en termes de succès de financement ou de business. Puis c'était vraiment une discussion intéressante. We also spoke about kind of how our topic came to be and how it started with transportation as a social determinant of health, in terms of the need to access Indigenous communities needing to access services in other communities and municipalities or urban areas, perhaps. And then from there, it kind of developed through discussions, and in Yukon, it led to using the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report as a example of where transportation misses the gap when it comes to serving communities.
On a parlé de plusieurs de choses dans notre chambre de Zoom. Et we took a tour around the world with our questions from our participants talking about EV batteries. We talked about the regulatory environment in Canada and challenges versus federal and provincial regulations. We talked about relationships with the US. We talked about how the EU, the European Union, is really leading the way in terms of regulation around end of battery life for EV vehicles. And we talked about very, very recent changes in New Jersey and EPR regulations that have come out there. And then we ended our discussion by talking about the future of transportation and where things might go. So we took a trip around the world and then went far into the future.
We, of course, our subgroup was discussing the same topic. Many of the same discussions occurred. I want to say we are very thankful for those that came to our discussion today, because it gave us a chance, and I thought what was really fun for us was that the questions were what was not in the report. It was what about this, and the opportunity to discuss that all of our reports are at the leading edge of things. So many of these questions have not been answered yet, and the report in the pages that we had require clarity. So we had a really wonderful opportunity to talk about all the research that we did, all of the things that we are very passionate about that did not get into the report, and especially for those of you that are watching right now and thinking about applying, I thought it was a lot of fun to talk about the early process and what we didn't end up doing. So what we talked about and why we chose our topic that we did now, and to go back on this 10-month process and to be able to talk about all the people that we met, all the people that contributed to us, all that we learned on our trips, and some of the things that we saw that we didn't know about, because many of us spend a lot of time enacting a lot of change in our part of Canada, and the opportunity to connect with the rest of the country and to be here in Montreal. And I thanked one of our participants that was in person here in Montreal, because they were very kind to ask their questions to us in English and to engage us in English, which is my language and my tongue, and the opportunity to really connect across this country. It's been really special, and we're so thankful for everyone that participated today, because you made this special. It was one thing to do a report and then to put it out there, but it was a whole other thing to be able to passionately speak about it and to share our knowledge and gain knowledge. Some of the people that were with us gave us ideas that now when we go and take these reports forth to decision makers, we learned more today. So thank you to all of you that came today.
Thank you, Joey. That is a great plug to mention that applications are now open. So if you liked what you saw, et vous pensez, hey, moi j'aimerais passer 10 mois à explorer un sujet sur lequel je connais rien au début, you can't do it again though, then you have until March 11th to apply for next year, where we've already announced the theme. It'll be about the future of the resource sector, the natural resource sector. So thank you to all the fellows who are up here. Un grand merci à tout le monde qui est venu. Thank you so much for coming. For those of you in person, please stay. We have some nibbles and some drinks and the opportunity to keep discussing. Pour ceux en ligne, you can go and make dinner and feed yourselves. But thank you so much for joining. Merci à tout le monde. Bonne soirée. Et as those of us slowly head over, I just want to give the opportunity d'un mot de nos hôtes, la Maison du Développement Durable.
Merci Sarah-Christine. Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à la Maison du Développement Durable. Welcome to the MDD. A bad word in English. I'm really thrilled that you guys have chosen this place for your event, because it was built in order to inspire future leaders, which is exactly what you're meant to be. There's a long legacy of graduates from your program at the MDD that have passed through some of the head of the organizations over here. Daria was also one of yours, so really thrilled to have you. This building's got a lot of cool features. It was built in 2011. It was the first building LEED Platinum new construction in Quebec, one of the first in Canada. It's got a cool, like a green roof that captures the water that is flushed in the toilets. It's got 26 geothermal wells under the building for the heat. Noticed how we passed from plus 15 to minus 15 today? Most of the buildings in Montreal will be sweltering hot today, and it was just perfect. It's amazing the resilience that this building comes with. It's got this green wall. It's having a tough time, the green wall these days, but it still works with its function in place, so it humidifies the building in the winter and decreases a bit the temperature in the summer. So in any case, really thrilled to have all of you here today. We hope that it has inspired you and that you will be inspired to do more of these in the future. We really need this. When you build a building, it's here for 50 years. It's not just a question of costs today when you build it, it's operational costs and benefits for decades to come. Thank you very much.
Merci.